Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Director of the Global Perspectives Office. Our guest today is Jack Mendelsohn, who has a long career in international security and arms control, having worked for the U.S. government, for a number of private organizations, including the Arms Control Association, and has taught at a number of universities, including George Washington and American universities in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Mendelsohn.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you. Tell us a little bit about your interest in strategic matters. Where did this start? And then we'll fast forward to the present time. How did you get into this?
Well, I worked for the U.S. government as a Foreign Service officer for 23 years. And midway in my career, I was having lunch in the lunchroom, somebody came up to me and said, "How would you like to serve on the SALT delegation?" I didn't have the foggiest idea what he was talking about. I said, "Well, tell me a little bit about it." And he said, "We've got a big negotiation going on with the Russians where we're talking about trying to limit nuclear weapons. And it takes place in Geneva, and it's not a permanent assignment. You go over and come back and go over and come back." So I said, "Sounds fine, sign me up."
Not a hardship.
Not a hardship. That was 1972, and I worked for 3 years on the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, negotiations. They went on for much longer, but there's only so much of anything that you can take. And then came back to the United States, and the Department of State assigned me to NATO, where I worked on conventional weapons arms limitation talks for a couple of years in Brussels. I came back, and then the government asked me to join the next series of talks on strategic weapons, which was the START negotiations, and I was on that for about 2 years. And that's how I basically, you learn through doing. I basically did that job for the government. When I left and retired, I joined a non-governmental organization that specialized in arms control, was with them for about 15 years. Now I've been teaching arms control.
Wonderful. And when you were in the midst of negotiating these strategic arms limitation and reduction talks, did you anticipate that the Soviet Union's demise was around the corner, or were you of the mindset that this was sort of an open-ended threat?
I didn't consider the fact that they might end. What I did know from knowing the intelligence information on their systems, and from knowing a certain amount about what was going on in Russia in terms of politics and economics, I did know that they weren't the threat that was sort of puffed up and believed in some quarters in the United States. I knew they had incredible vulnerabilities, they had incredible weaknesses. On the other hand, they had nuclear weapons, and that sort of distorted, if you will, our view of them. I mean, one of the favorite descriptions of the Soviet Union was, it's really Upper Volta with nuclear weapons. Upper Volta is now Burkina Faso, a very, very poor Central African country. And that was what the point of the comparison was. This other, apart from the nuclear weapons establishment, the Soviet Union really was an underdeveloped country.
So it was a superpower primarily in terms of its military capability.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, it's a little bit like a guy who lifts weights and has one enormous arm, but the rest of his body is sort of normal. It was a very, very strange and a very, very disproportionate emphasis put on the fact that they were a nuclear power, and they had no other trappings really that would entitle them to a sort of major power role. But nuclear weapons are not to be dismissed, and obviously in terms of politics we had to pay attention, and also in terms of our own national interest. It seemed to me, and it seemed to others obviously, that it was senseless to keep building nuclear weapons and threatening one another. I mean, at one point we and the Russians each had between 10 and 12,000 nuclear weapons deployed, ready to use against one another. That didn't seem to make a hell of a lot of sense. What did seem to make sense was, hey, is there some way we can stop this senseless racing, put a cap on the arsenals and then think about beginning to draw them down. And indeed, that's what happened. Starting in 72, well, actually starting in 69 under Nixon. Reason I said 62 is the first time the first agreement came out in, I'm sorry, 72. First agreement came out in 72. And we ran this, this process of negotiations up until the first Bush administration, when we concluded the current agreement, the START I agreement. The Clinton administration, while it supported these treaties, wasn't able to negotiate anything further. They had their own domestic problems after '94. It was very difficult for them to do anything in the national security area. Plus, in '94, the U.S. politics took a turn for the more neo-realist is a nice phrase for it, but conservative. We basically got much harder line. And in the Bush administration, they publicly and loudly sort of renounced arms control and even non-proliferation as something, you know, that's something that superpowers don't do. It was no longer, since our primary adversary had in effect disintegrated and the threat had gone away with it, we were left as the most powerful, strongest, best armed, et cetera, nation in the world. And why did we need treaties? Because we were powerful, we could do what we wanted. Treaties are for weak countries to try to ensnare the strong. And since we're the strong, why submit to that? And that's basically what this administration was its policy. It did come to an agreement, the Bush administration, with Russia on a very, very loose agreement that has no dates in it, it has no schedule in it, it has no verification procedures in it, that the United States and Russia would by 2012 bring down the number of its deployed nuclear weapons to between 1,700 and 2,200. That's not bad, considering that we had between 10 and 12,000 in the 1980s, but it took 30 years, or it's going to take 30 years to get down to about 2,000. Also, this administration, another aspect of the nuclear standoff, if you will, is the U.S. and other nations' efforts to constrain the spread of nuclear weapons. No one can conceive of it being in anybody's interest for the number of nuclear states to grow. There are currently 9 states that possess nuclear weapons. And everybody knows, the United States, is very, very concerned about other nations which we consider to be irresponsible members of the international community, very concerned about these irresponsible nations like Iraq, like Iran, like North Korea, getting a hold of nuclear weapons because, you know, since they're irresponsible, who knows what they're going to do. And incidentally, you know, we're the sort of, at least in the analytic minds, we're the prime targets for these people. And so this administration has, had a number of options. One of the options was to attack and invade. We did that with Iraq. It turned out it wasn't necessary. We're currently negotiating after several years, 6 years, of refusing to talk to North Korea. We have finally gotten to the table ourselves with the North Koreans and 4 other countries, so-called 6-party talks, and gotten the North Koreans to say, well, if you, the United States and the West, are prepared to do A, B, C, and D, we, North Korea, are prepared to do A, B, C, and D prime. And so you can be hopeful that that's going to work out. The third issue, the third country that's giving us a problem is Iran. And Iran belongs to the non-proliferation regime and claims that what it is now doing, building up its nuclear power infrastructure, that this infrastructure is permitted by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that they, Iran, have a perfect right to do what they want in the nuclear power sector. They're absolutely right. The administration and many others say, well, it is true that they're permitted to do this, but we believe that they are not building up the infrastructure for power purposes. They're building it up to build weapons, building up the infrastructure in order to obtain weapons.
And I think that's a fear that many of us would share. I was struck as you were talking about the countries that have developed nuclear weapons, especially of late, by the fact that all are in Asia, Near East or Far East. Is there a reason for this? And I've read a number of articles over the years written by analysts who talk about, you know, how successful we've been, relatively speaking, in our non-proliferation efforts in much of the rest of the world, but not so much in Asia. Why is Asia different?
Well, one fact of the matter is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is perhaps the most widely, or one of the most widely adhered to treaties that exists in the international community. It has 189 members. There are, however, 3 countries that never joined it, and they never joined it because they had specific security worries. At the time the treaty was negotiated, although they could have joined later, they still considered that they had regional security concerns that dictated that they not give up the nuclear weapons right.
And those are, for those who may not know.
There's one exception from the Asia thing, was Israel, whose regional concerns everybody's aware of. The other 2 nations are India and Pakistan. And there's a whole nexus of connections between China, India, and Pakistan that go way back even to, you know, to the creation of these states. But let's start with the primary driver, and that's China. China obtained nuclear weapons in 1964, but it had been skirmishing with India over territory several years prior to that. And so India certainly felt that if it was going to be able to face up to China or any threats from China in the future, it had to have a nuclear weapon. And so it began developing a nuclear weapon. Taking the pathway that we're afraid Iran will take, which is converting their peaceful nuclear power infrastructure into one that could supply and provide materials for nuclear weapons. That's another story, but that's basically sort of the pattern for what we're afraid will happen in Iran. So India had always reserved its right to develop nuclear weapons. After the conflicts with China and with an ongoing border dispute, felt it had to develop nuclear weapons, and in 1974 they exploded a nuclear weapon. Well, so the argument here that I'm trying to make is that India's nuclear weapon was really a response to China. Pakistan's nuclear weapon, however, came as a response to India. So there's sort of a chain: China, India, Pakistan. It wasn't, as some people may believe, it wasn't an Indian-Pakistani standoff that led to this. It was a Chinese, Indian, and then Pakistani chain, if you will. Well, in 1974, India exploded a nuclear weapon, and Pakistan certainly felt it was going to have to do something about this. It could not be, because it had fought several wars, 3 of them, I believe, since independence, with India over various issues, and they still have a big border issue in Kashmir. Well, in 1998, India sort of took the wraps off of its nuclear weapons program and exploded a whole series of weapons. 2 weeks later, Pakistan exploded its nuclear weapon. Directly in response to, and just as many, they tried to have just as many tests as the Indians had, and that's how we got in the sort of that nexus of nuclear weapon states in Asia. The one that I didn't mention, which is a little bit separate, is North Korea. And North Korea was a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but in the late 80s, early 90s, began to move away from the treaty, say that it was not any longer, not any longer want to be a member of the treaty, and it was suspected in the West that North Korea had been using its nuclear power infrastructure to provide nuclear explosive materials for its weaponry.
But if North Korea had intentions along these lines, why did it join the treaty in the first place? Was it something it did on its own, or was it substantially because of China's pressure?
It was pressured into joining. I think it probably would have preferred not to, but if you will, it was pressured into it, and it also thought, I suspect it thought it would sort of relieve some of the suspicions outside if it joined the NPT. But after it joined the NPT, it found out that there were some obligations that were, if fully carried out, would probably expose what they had been up to, which is trying to collect explosive nuclear materials out of the nuclear infrastructure.
And wasn't there a lag between the time the North Koreans initially agreed to become a part of the treaty and it was actually ratified?
Yes, there was a lag between when they joined and when they would allow the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in to do the inspections that are required under the NPT. Well, some of your viewers will remember in the early 90s, under the Clinton administration, there was a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, and the Clinton administration negotiated a kind of a settlement, which was going to freeze the North Korean nuclear program in exchange for economic, diplomatic, financial, if you will, in the case of supplying oil and food, which is replacements or exchanges from the West. That 1994 agreement, neither side really fulfilled its obligations under it. And I know in the West it's it's usual to say the North Koreans cheated, and they did indeed violate the treaty, but the fact of the matter is the West didn't live up to its commitments either. The United States said it would, try to get North Korea off the terrorist list, that we would open up diplomatic contacts, that we would stop sanctioning North Korea, allow them to join international organizations, et cetera, and so forth. None of that happened, and North Korea basically renounced the treaty, and in '06 tested a nuclear weapon. So our suspicions were right, but they had not tested a weapon in '94, and perhaps if all of the conditions had been filled, we would not have gotten to that '06 test. We did. Another crisis arose, of course, after the test. Its neighbors now were very, very concerned. China, Russia, South Korea, Japan, who are all members of this discussion, were very concerned about the North Korean nuclear weapon. And so we've gone into very, very detailed, lengthy, difficult discussions with the North Koreans to, in effect, getting them back to the agreement that we had in 1994, the basic terms of the agreement, which is that North Korea has agreed on a gradual basis to eliminate its nuclear infrastructure, both peaceful and war and military.
And what about the treaty itself? Is there a mechanism for rejoining it, or is that gone?
That's an issue that people would rather not talk about. The argument is that they can't really withdraw from the treaty. Obviously, they believe they have, but the United Nations and the treaty keepers have not really released them, although they don't abide by the conditions of it. So I think if they indeed denuclearize, they'll be back in the treaty. There's no reason why they won't be, and everything will be like it was before. But we've got a long way to go, except that we are at a point where the North Koreans have frozen their nuclear program. We've released monies that had been blocked by the United States that the North Koreans insisted was part of the deal. And we're now working out a very, very detailed schedule of who does what when. And the North Koreans don't trust us much more than we trust them, because they saw what happened in '94. They didn't get what we said they were going to get, at least in their minds. They're pretty clear we didn't fulfill our side of the treaty. And we know that they didn't fill their side of the treaty, so now we're going very slowly, but very, very, very consecutively to try to work out a schedule, a framework for getting North Korea off of the nuclear weapons track. If it succeeds, and I think there's a chance that it will succeed as long as we're willing to talk and not be threatening, North Koreans don't react well to threats. We haven't been able to push them around, and the nuclear weapon was in effect their way of saying, will you please listen to us? We're trying to say something here, and here's a nuclear weapon to show you that we're serious. You know, we want to be reintegrated into the Western or in the international community, and here's our pass to that reintegration. That got the attention of everybody, that nuclear test in '06.
And so this situation, as was the case in '94, appears to be on the way to getting resolved, which is positive, but not the case in other countries where we have nuclear questions. Iran, you mentioned, and then there's the India-Pakistan situation. If you could talk about India-Pakistan for just a moment, especially in light of the disruption that's taken place in Pakistan of late, where the country has moved away from its democratic traditions.
Well, there are two things. Let me mention one thing on each side. And the question of Pakistan having a nuclear weapon, our concern has been, I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. They don't belong to the NPT. We're not going to attack them. They are a major ally of ours in the fight against terror. The big concern with Pakistan has been that in the past, it has been a proliferator, that one of its senior nuclear establishment scientists, in effect, sold nuclear technology to other nations. He proliferated privately, if you will. The Pakistanis said that was not a government plan. It was, you know, sort of individual enterprise. Call it what you will. In any case, the Pakistanis have been guilty of allowing nuclear technology to go to nations that were not nuclear. I mean, it wouldn't, if they let it go to Russia, which is a nuclear power, or China, it would be one thing. But they let it go to nations that were not nuclear and striving to be nuclear. So that's one concern. The second concern is they have an arsenal of nuclear weapons. And if there is really serious turmoil, if there is a swing to the extremist side in Pakistan, concerns of the West, not just the United States, will be what happens to that arsenal. We don't want the wrong people to get their hands on a nuclear weapon. Totally understandable. Both of these things, I think, are fairly clear. Problem with Pakistan, proliferation, and perhaps the loss of control over a nuclear arsenal. In the case of India, we have a slightly different issue going on now. The Bush administration, over the last 2 years, has struck a deal with India whereby we, the United States, will provide them with peaceful nuclear technology. Now, that's permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But, you'll recall, India does not belong to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And under US law, we cannot trade in nuclear technology with a nation that is not in, a non-nuclear nation, or even a nuclear one, I suppose, that's not in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But this administration has a slightly different strategy in mind, and that is we are trying to enlist strategic allies in Asia, partly, if not primarily, as a hedge against what may happen in China's future, where in Washington, China is viewed as the most likely peer competitor of the United States in this century. Let's say, certainly, in 2, 3, 4 decades, that's going to be the other major power, sort of, if you will, taking the place of what used to be the Soviet Union in our standoff with them in the Cold War. So the theory or the thinking in Washington and in this administration was we should be trying to strategically ally ourselves with India, and one way to show how serious we are, and one way that the Indians would be very interested and delighted to deal with us, is if we could release the ban on the trade in nuclear technology. And we have basically agreed, there's an agreement, that we will supply India with what they need for their power production area. Now, there was support in the US Congress for this. Interestingly enough, the Indian Parliament is divided over whether they want to approve this agreement or not, because some of the more extreme members of Parliament believe that the treaty still implies limitations on India's freedom of action. I think that's good if it does, and I think it would be good if the Indian Parliament rejected it, because, in my view, agreeing to deal with India on nuclear issues when it is a nuclear weapon state and not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty undercuts the United States' arguments and moral authority to say that a country like Iran cannot develop a nuclear power industry. It's a direct contradiction with what US policy has been over the last 4, 5 decades. This administration claims India is a responsible member of the international community. It is not a terrorist state, and we do believe we should be good allies with them. In other words, we can do this with India because it's a good country. The Iran, even though it belongs to the NPT and it's legally allowed to have nuclear power, we don't believe that they should pursue certain aspects of it because they're not a responsible member of the community. We're making judgments above and beyond the international community's statements.
And we'll have to stop at this point, but I'd like to thank you for joining us today, Mr. Mendelsohn. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia, and we'll see you next time.